Hey everyone. Oftentimes Christians have a habit of being very reductionist in their outlook and their worldview in regards to spiritual realities. So this often leads Christians that are searching and for knowledge and information, it often leads them away from Christianity into traditions and practices that have a more full-orbed, all-encompassing view of reality that includes spiritual realms and things like this. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. Why is it that Christians often have a habit of just dividing everything into black and white? Why don't they recognize a more gray reality in existence? So I'm going to explore that a little bit. So neutral beings. What about neutral beings? How do they work? Okay, so God in the Bible has always preferred to work in a more mediatorial manner, where he has hierarchies and he communicates to us through angelic hierarchies. He sends messengers to deliver messages. Lots of cases of this. He has the divine council with the watchers and all of this. So there's a chain of command, and he tends to work through this. Now, of course, there's a lot of exceptions. Most of these exceptions are with Old Testament or New Testament saints, where he does speak directly. There's and with the work of Christ, we do have direct access through that. So there are exceptions, but typically he works in this mediatorial manner, right? So what does that mean for creation and all of nature, for example? Well, I'm going to put this in simpler terms than like Aristotle typically would, for example, but there are levels of consciousness in beings, in creation. The levels typically determine the ability to which beings can determine their own moral choices, like choosing God or not choosing God. So angels and other spiritual entities, as well as humans, have the most ability to choose God or not, right? To obey or not. Thus, this category is very black and white, typically. But there's another gray category, right? Typically, these would be beings that have less of a developed consciousness, but these are often called elementals, for example. Elementals and neutral beings. These are the spiritual forces that animate nature, okay? And obviously, they were created by God, right? So all matter has a personal origin. Personal psychic energy is communicated down through to the matter. So as an example, let me just show, I've gone over this before in other videos, but let me show how Valentin Tomberg explains this in Meditations on the Tarot. He says, matter is condensed energy, energy is condensed psychic force, and psychic force is the condensation of consciousness or spirit. Consciousness implying a personal reality. So you have a causal chain, and this is really just a different way to word what Thomas Aquinas believes or what Aristotle believed. So you have this causal chain of spirit down to the material or matter, right? And I outline in those hyphens there's a personal intent behind all of these things. So what does that actually mean practically, right? So let me go back to my notes here. So Oswald Chambers in biblical psychology further elaborates on this whole idea of spirit causing matter by postulating that the phrase "the life is in the blood" actually means that blood itself as a substance more strongly communicates spirit than any other material substance. So, for example, the Eucharist being the blood of Christ and the body and blood communicating Christ's spirit to us, right? So there's a lot of thoughts right there, but just to kind of condense it down, neutral entities, neutral beings, these called by many names, these are spiritual consciousnesses, beings that animate physical nature typically around us, right? And yeah, that Oswald Chambers anecdote I thought was very interesting regarding blood and that certain class of beings that have blood, where blood itself communicates spirit more strongly. Especially like the implications for the Eucharist, I think, is really intriguing. So let me also jump over to a guy named Rudolf Steiner, and we can get into some of the more specific details of elemental beings. Okay, those spiritual animating beings. So let me go to that. So this is from his book, What is Biodynamics? This is by Rudolf Steiner, and that's a guy that has influenced Valentin Tomberg, as well as guys like Owen Barfield, one of C.S. Lewis's frenemies. So Steiner talks about, he gives names to these beings. Steiner was a clairvoyant, kind of like Edgar Cayce, where Steiner was actually able to see these spiritual realities and see these beings. Throughout history, you'll have institutes like the Findhorn Institute and things like this, where they focus a lot on communing with spiritual beings in nature. So they'll talk a lot about fairies and gnomes and all these things. So there is a lot of evidence that shows that these are real spiritual beings that have a personal energy behind them, a personal consciousness, right? Even though it's that consciousness is at a level lower than that of humans. I'll get to that in a second. But basically, Steiner, as an example, I'll read this. In a spiritual sense, the gnomes in their home underground receive these forces as secrets from the universe. These cosmic mysteries are no mysteries to the gnomes. The gnomes are perfectly attuned to them and understand them. And while they are at home within the earth, they harbor repugnance for what is earthly. They fear taking on earthly forms, in particular, the shape of amphibians. In their aversion, they drive plants upward out of the ground that is the gnome's home. There, the undines, watery nature beings that live in the moist atmosphere, begin their work. These elementals in their dreaming nature assume an ever-changing variety of forms. They love the watery element, but as they flit around the plant, they try to avoid taking on the permanent shapes of fishes, etc., etc., etc. So this might sound completely bizarro, wacky, and I understand why you might think that, but Steiner is really hitting on a really significant point here, that there is a spiritual consciousness behind the forces of nature, okay? They might be neutral, not morally good or bad, not morally for God or against God, but they were created by God, and they are constantly animating nature. And this is what Thomas Aquinas says, where he says, God is not just a first cause, he is a constant cause. Every single moment is caused by God, right? I forget I'm forgetting a word about that, but anyway. So Steiner is giving names to these things based upon a lot of the traditional folklore, right? So, for example, he might call in the modern era, we might have a scientific name for the forces that cause plants to grow up out of the ground. Scientists might have a name for the chemical that causes plants to grow. But Steiner understood this reality on a spiritual level, right? On a more fundamental level of what is causing these plants to go up. So he was able to form a holistic view of nature and how farming works, for example, without the minutia of the scientific naming and all of this crap. So this is how, for example, traditional people we're able to understand very intimately how nature worked and how best to plant things, how to grow things. You have the almanacs and the seasons of the stars and everything. I mean, even in the Bible, the stars represent angels, right? They would say that behind every star, spiritually speaking, is an angelic being. Okay? So this stuff is not foreign to Christianity. It's not foreign to the Bible, right? There's just different ways of naming it, different ways to explain it. So yeah, let me go back to my notes now. These elementals, it might be the gnomes or the undines, as he says. These elementals have only a small amount of free will and personal awareness. That's why they can be mischievous towards humans, right? They might cause us a little trouble, right? You have lots of folklore things about people leaving food out for the little fairies and things like that to kind of appease them or whatever. So they might be mischievous towards humans, but not usually completely evil or completely good. Yet, as we see in, for example, in the life of Saint Anthony, which was a book written, I think, by Saint Athanasius about Saint Anthony the monk, we can see that elementals do have an awareness of God, yet they don't fully understand their role in his plans. Because, for example, the being that Saint Anthony encountered asked Saint Anthony to pray for him because he didn't know what the future held for him in God's plans. He didn't know if he was going to be destroyed or saved or whatever. And yeah, about the mischievousness, for example, about these elementals, I think it was Carl Trueman, the Presbyterian guy, that talked about how in Presbyterian culture in Scotland, for example, it was not uncommon that even Calvinists of the time would still believe in things like fairies and gnomes and things like this, because it's a spiritual way of understanding the forces of nature, right? And those people that believe in fairies and such, they oftentimes they end up being vindicated by later science, right? And this is why Rudolf Steiner was able to hit on so many profound truths of biodynamics, and then the scientists were able to confirm those truths later on. So anyway, it's not so I guess the Carl Trueman anecdote is to say that it's not believing in these things, in fairies and gnomes and all this stuff. Believing in them is not anti-Christian, and it's very frustrating to a lot of Christian people when they are they're kind of gaslit into believing that they can't be Christian if they believe in these things, right? So the question is more like, how should a Christian interact with these things rather than if they should believe them or not? All right, back to my notes. Humans can interact with and possibly even manipulate these elemental beings or neutral beings, usually through God's help or otherwise. The other methods would typically be bad because it would typically be called witchcraft, for example, seizing power for yourself, right, without God. So, for example, almost all human saints have stories of being friends with animals. Saint Seraphim of Sarov loved bears, and they loved him, like many Russians. Elder Joseph the Hesychast was a friend of cats, and he has some stories about how, the cats would keep vigil with him and go to church with him and stuff. And of course, you have Saint Francis of Assisi in the West, who was famous for his love of animals and how they loved him, basically like a Mary Poppins kind of thing. Animals are animated by spirits, like the elementals would animate plants and such. But Oswald Chambers suggested that an animal species tends to be animated by just one spirit collectively. So like all bears, all deer, all cats, right? Each have their own spirit. Now, regarding consciousness and acting according to our nature, this is an interesting question that I thought of. So why would gnomes or undines or whatever just constantly do one thing all the time? wouldn't they get tired of it? The answer lies in how God created our natures and what these natures are intended for. So do gnomes get do gnomes get bored of carrying nutrients or pushing the plants upward, like Steiner says? No, and the reason why is because that's what they were made for. They are doing what accords to their nature. Okay, so they don't get tired of it. So do human saints get tired of worship and prayer? No, because among other things, that's what we are created for. If we don't worship God, we're worshiping something else, right? So, when people imagine Christian saints in heaven as constantly praying and worshiping, they think that sounds boring, right? But it only sounds boring here on earth because we are fallen and not living in accord with our true nature. Granted, heaven will be quite dynamic and creative, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying here. When we're given when we're made a new creation, right? In heaven, we're going to be doing what is in accord with that new creation's nature, if that makes sense. Now, why do Christians often ignore these realities? Why do they often have a tendency to just ignore the neutral elemental beings and just focus on the black and the white, right? Focus on good, bad, that's it. Totally reductionist of reality. Well, I think the answer is in the Old Testament. Most of the immorality in the Old Testament comes when people or individuals focus on creatures and creation more than the Creator himself. So that, to be fair to Christians that people say are reductionist or simplistic, they are just remembering these cautionary tales from the Old Testament, right? And they're using these to inform their current beliefs and practices, right? So oftentimes, even if a Christian is reductionist and they say these things aren't real, they might be wrong, but the result of their conclusion is that they just don't pay attention to it. And honestly, not paying attention to it is probably the better option than accidentally obsessing over it, So I've said this before in other videos, but if we focus on the Creator, we often get the creation thrown in for free, right? Focusing exclusively on the Creator often results in God gifting us with abilities like being friends to animals, or even something like parting the Red Sea, right? Just imagine the spiritual reality behind Moses parting the Red Sea, all of the water elementals obeying his command, right? God gave Moses the ability to command and control those water elemental beings. For Steiner, they might be called the undines, right? So I hope this makes sense. I know the beginning was a little bit rambly, but let me know your thoughts. This is something that I've thought about quite a bit. I'm sure I forgot something, but yeah, thank you. Bye.